All right, just a few front things and we'll get underway. This is the last lecture in the two-part series, and we've become a kind of a family, and don't think you're getting rid of me, because I'll be coming back occasionally on Thursdays, depending on my teaching schedule, and I'm seriously thinking about just giving up teaching for a while for writing, so that means that I might be a Thursday or a Wednesday, depending on what is needed. I promise you an in-depth lecture on the Zulu people. I haven't forgotten it, and I won't forget it. After the commercialization of what once was a holy day, I guess we'll start arranging schedules, and there'll be a time I'll come back for that. This Saturday, by way of giving an account of myself, I'll be going to Senegal for a pre-colloquium for the Festad. I'll be delivering a lecture from an extensive paper that has kind of broke my back this last month, Pan-Africanism, a history of an idea in the African world. Because I'm a stickler for what is new and what is different, and I wouldn't walk across the street just to do the ordinary. So if I can't write something exceptional about a theme, many times I leave the theme to amateurs and to students. But I looked at this word Pan-Africanism because this is the only thing that's going to save us anyway, a world unity of African people. And I looked at some new information I have on the black untouchables of India, numbering more than 100 million, and how they became untouchables, in the introduction of the concept of untouchability, and the large number of African people in the millions in the Pacific. And I looked again at my research file on the destruction of the African people in an island of Tasmania, where every single man, woman, and child was put to death. I wondered again about the international position of African people. But in my approach to Pan-Africanism for Senegal, I did not start my approach to the subject with 1900, when H. Sylvester Williams of Trinidad called the first conference in London. I started it 500 years before, when slaves on a ship learned what we seem to have forgotten, that though they came from different parts of Africa, different so-called tribes, spoke different languages, they all had the same problem and the same oppressor. This very evening, in a meeting at the Caribbean Cultural Center, we were discussing African culture, how to reclaim it. An Afro-American girl says she's just beginning to understand her culture, and she resents the fact that people just talk about slavery instead of culture. And a Nigerian student, lady, said that she has no culture problem. I'm from Nigeria, and I'm acquainted with my culture. And I've had no cultural disruption, which proves she's brainwashed by the West. A large number of the slaves who came to the West were Yorubas from Nigeria. Most of the revolts were set in motion by Yorubas, led by Akans from Ghana. Now let me illustrate this for a moment, then I'm going to go into the lesson, go into the lecture. Toussaint Louverture was a Akan, but he didn't set the Haitian Revolution in motion. The person that set it in motion was a Yoruba, Bokman, a priest. The revolt in Guyana, led by Kofi, well led by Kofi. But the man that set it in motion was Ankara, a Yoruba. The Yorubas and the Akans developed a partnership away from Africa that they never had in Africa. The same thing is true of the revolts in Brazil. It is the Yoruba culture that held it together. And they couldn't get to them until they broke through that strong Yoruba culture. The main staying power of the revolt in the Western world was Yoruba. When we look at Nat Turner, Dinmakbizi, Gabriel Prosser, we find the same kind of process. Then the young lady said that she understands Thomas Sobel because he said other ethnic groups built stores, factories, and pulled themselves up, and see no reason why blacks shouldn't do the same thing. A few years ago in a meeting in Washington, it was really a meeting of anti-Zionist Jews, and I happened to be one of the speakers. And afterward, some foreigner, a German, came over to me and says, "You know, Professor Clarke, other groups in America have pulled themselves up by their bootstrings. Why haven't your people done the same thing?" I lost my cool and I said that because someone stole our boots, you racist. People are expecting the impossible of us. Pull yourself up by your bootstring and you've got no boots. The neatest trick of the week if you manage to bring it off. Then this girl said, she said that, why don't blacks progress like other groups? I said, look, every group came here looking for something. We were not brought here to be given democracy, citizenship. When the American dream was dreamed, it wasn't dreamed for us. When the American promise was made, it wasn't made to us. At the turn of the century, our family was less than 50 years old because during slavery, it was against the law to have a family. Now, you expect our family to be the same as other people's family? We just put it together the day before yesterday? Now, the same man who's judging you and writing the textbooks about you is the man that broke up your family in the first place and made it a law against the law for someone to teach you to read. That's the same man that's calling you dumb. And too many times we accept the blame for a lot of things. A lack of stimulation, a lack of black hero worship. Where you going to see a black hero? You look at all the television you look at. Where are you going to see a black hero? Remember when Bill Crosby played in I Spy? He couldn't even get a black woman. And when he got one, he lost. This other guy was knocking over blondes and brunettes all over the place. Oh no, then they said a black man's a criminal if he have feelings the other way, but the mass media has given him feelings the other way. Because the mass media in 20 minutes can do more educating than other people can do in 20 hours. With our kids looking at all these misconceptions of the hero and never seeing themselves emerge as the hero. He has some misconceptions about himself and his ability to be a hero. In this evening's discussion, talking about culture and how to infuse our culture into the curricula, everybody forgot to emphasize that slavery was a war on our culture. It was a war on the culture of all the non-European people of the whole world. And that the most cultured people in the world were told they had no culture and also had no God that was worth worshiping. So the European not only gave you a new psyche, a new mentality, new clothes to wear, a new God to worship, then he didn't have to build jails. His building jails was redundant because he already had you in one and still have you in one. When I look at this beautiful Nigerian girl spouting all this conservative nonsense, but she knows her history already, and I just asked her a simple question. How did Nigeria get its name? It wasn't always named Nigeria. How did it get its name? All right, very simple. Near the end of the 19th century, Lord Lugard was governing all that territory for England. And the chartered companies, these commercial companies, had their own armies governing each territory, all of them rapers, all of them gangsters. Same as the two gangsters in Washington now arguing over territory. You think you got a friend among them. Just like gangsters, you take the east side, I take the west side, don't you bother my territory, I won't bother yours. They ain't talking about socialism, and one's a socialist. They ain't talking about capitalism, and one's a capitalist. They ain't talking about Christianity, and one's a Christian. They ain't talking about democracy, and another one's supposed to believe in that. They're talking about territory, how to control it, and the fact that the white people of the world have dwindled to 1/5 of the world's population. And if they don't watch themselves in bed or out of bed, we will discover they are the minority. So once they put it together, they're going to have to ask them for permission. And once we remember the one thing about power is the ability to include and exclude, there's a whole lot of people they're going to have to deal with. All right, now back to the subject. Because we have a lot of miseducated African people around the world. And we've got a lot of African people who can be educated overnight. They're so hungry for it. When they had the difficulty in Fiji, when they discovered that some American blacks were interested in that case and some Africans were interested in that case, they said, we thought we were alone in the world. We didn't know we had so many relatives. They had no problem becoming African people. They had no problem relating to the other relatives in the world. Glad to do it. We're a big family. Now, my talk for tonight, and unfortunately the last in the series, will deal almost solely with the African Americans, the lonely nation away from home. Because the African American is the most misunderstood, most abused, most wounded of all the African people who live outside of Africa. And yet, he is the target for destruction by more forces than any other African people. He's the one African that the Western world won't destroy. Principally because he has grown insensitive to his oppressor, and he, more than any other African, have fought in larger numbers for his oppressor and mastered his oppressor's modern war technique. He's also the most dangerous African on the face of the earth, because he is the only African on the face of the earth trained in the modern warfare technique called combined operations. Combined operations is the art of striking a target land, air, and sea. No other Africans on the face of the earth have enough training to move on a target with ships, airplanes, and infantry. And the black American has been trained to do all three. He wasn't trained to do this to liberate himself or to liberate anyone. He was trained to do this for someone else. But the training is still with him. But he has never converted his training into a liberation army for himself. After World War II, Africa could have picked up almost for nothing one of the finest black air forces on the face of the earth. But because Africa was not ready to do this, their talent deteriorated. Many of the men went bussing dishes and clerking and lost all their skills. But I'm saying that the skill and the training to make a modern army was with the black American. And right now, right this very minute, there's been enough black Americans discharged from the U.S. Army with enough modern skill, they can train a modern army for every nation in Africa. This is what makes him the target for the colonialists, because they realize if contact is ever made with him, and if he becomes aware of his skills and affect the wedding between his skills in Africa, he could change the world around. He could have stopped the Congo situation. He can revitalize any nation in Africa. Because of his training, he can learn faster than almost any other African on the face of the earth. The question is, why then do we have slums? If he can fix houses, why don't he fix them? Why then do we have dope? Why is his institution deteriorating? Why is he debating his integration instead of maintaining his institution? Because his mind has been trained into dependency. I'm saying that one thing about Jim Crow, one thing about that oppression, it was real. And you had something being built for him, by him, to sustain his institutions and sustain himself, and he had no illusion about the fact that he could depend on someone else to do it for him. There was a time you either went to a black college or you didn't go to no college at all. You went to a black church or you didn't go to no church at all, because you were not then and still are not welcome in the white church. And blacks created not only a new church institution, but a new religion and a new approach to God. And preached as though the God that they were addressing their message to was totally different from the God the white folks were talking about and talking to. They may well be true. Jimmy Swagger's God can't possibly be mine. This was the survival of African culture. All right. Let's see how the mystery was set in motion and what makes the difference. The difference is not got anything to do with who's got the best brain. The difference has got nothing to do with personal bravery. The difference has got to do with the isolation and the nature of oppression and what each one had to react to. And the difference has got to do with what oppressor left you with illusions and what oppressors did. Now, a few weeks ago, only 3 weeks ago, in the meeting on Marcus Garvey in Jamaica, I said, because I didn't want to disturb a lot of people by saying it in the public lecture, but in the private gathering, I said, now that the public is not here and we're just here having ourselves some nice Jamaican food and drink together, let's level with each other. Marcus Garvey is 47 years dead. If Marcus Garvey were alive today walking in the streets of Jamaica, somebody might stone him to death, advocating the same thing. And yet what Marcus Garvey advocated is the most important thing that is needed not only in Jamaica, but in the whole of the African world. Now, he rarely ever used the word Pan-Africa, and yet he was the ultimate Pan-Africanist, fighting for the unity of the whole of the African world. And as though it was planned, while I was in Jamaica, the very next day, they gave medals to the Jamaicans who participated in the invasion of Grenada. A contradiction to end all contradiction. I explained that he did not succeed in Jamaica principally because the Jamaicans then and now have the illusion of nation. And we in the United States then and now was never given the illusion of nation. They will let us know right now that they don't want us here. And they didn't let us dream that we were part of this nation. They let us know that we were brought to do a set labor. And once the labor was over, we were a surplus population. A nation within a nation without a nationality. We were not brought to this country to be given a nationality. We were not brought to this country to be given status. When they said liberty and justice for all, we were not a part of the all. No one let us dream or think that we were part of the all. When we look at the atrocities against us day by day, they keep saying again and again, not you. When I say American citizen, I don't mean you. Now, this nation has mortgaged its soul and lived a lie and tells a lie to the world because they dare not face up to the fact that you've got a massive nation inside of the United States living under a condition many times worse than Nazism. The United States can address itself to Russian Jewry, all about human rights. Don't you think this girl, these cops raped, has human rights? They won't address themselves to any issue of this kind. Well, all right. Because we have not examined the illusion that went into the original entry in the United States that wouldn't go away. We can't deal with the present because we think that maybe this country has betrayed us. This country has not betrayed us. Didn't promise you anything in the first place because they wasn't talking to you. If you're in an English country, they give you the illusion that they're talking to you. Read the Mansfield decision on slavery. He who touches British soil, breathes British air, becomes a free man. That sounds real good. British kept slavery 100 years after that. Mansfield decision. You think the British becoming liberal? Nothing. They were freeing the slaves in England because the slave was redundant in England. Wasn't even needed in England. And either he had to free the slaves or put in England or put down a revolt of the British working class who wanted their jobs. So he didn't free them out of benevolence. He freed them out of necessity. All right, now when we arrived in the country had not worked out its racial pattern. 1619, 1 year before the Mayflower. And we won't talk about the Mayflower people because they're not exactly my favorite people anyway. And I often tell my students, if someone say they came over on the Mayflower, descended from those people, do not laugh directly in their face. Cup your head and laugh to one side. Have good manners. Those were discards, degenerates, thrown out of Harlem, fornicating with the sisters and the mothers in the street. Then they came to America and began to oppress the Indians. Then the governor of the Massachusetts colony wrote back to England, "No, why did you send these people over here?" But when we arrived, they had not worked out the pattern. They hadn't even worked out the color scheme. And there were so many poor whites who were indentured servants, and we became indentured servants, not chattel slaves at first. And so the white indentured servant and the black indentured servant didn't see any difference in their status, so they got along well and married each other, and with no eyebrows raised about it. Poor was poor. They were all treated terrible in the filthy ships that they brought the British indentured servants over. Was about as filthy as the one that brought the Africans over. So now you had to create a color scheme to put the poor whites against the blacks. While when England had put the poor white, posed the poor whites against the blacks from the beginning by giving the whites job categories that always made them look above and better than the blacks. And most of these whites were poor Irish. You don't talk about the Irish not as really some of the first of the indentured servants. These poor Irish became the most ruthless slave drivers. Simon Legree and Uncle Tom's Cabin was Irish. We don't examine our literature on the subject because people beat on our head in order to impress someone else there, someone else. To understand what I'm talking about, you have to understand once more the design of the country. White, male, Protestant, middle class and up, those who agreed with the prevailing political status quo and who owned property. Everybody in this country is trying to impress that group. The Jews are trying to impress that group. The Catholics try to impress that group. That is the big rooster in the pecking order. And if you watch chickens in a yard, the big rooster can peck anybody. But instead of pecking him, you peck the next smallest one till you get down to the bitty. But you don't peck the first pecker, which is the rooster. This is what you call the pecking order. You pass the peck down, but you don't pass it up. So the Gentile, white, male Protestant, is the rooster in the barnyard. He has his way. And if you look at a book called 60 American Families, the richest people in this country falls into that category right now. And the same 60 families and their descendants who control the major wealth in the country at the turn of the century still control the major wealth in the country. All right, now, back to what happened to that original group, 19 group, about 20. They worked their way out of indenture. They became landowners. And one Anthony Johnson became a slave owner. And why we know so much about this is because slaves could at that time take their master to court for brutal treatment, and one of his slaves had to take him to court. This is why we got a record of it. Now, I'm not proud of a black slaveholder, but as a matter of record, there was some black slaveholders. In Carter G. Woodson's book on the early black families, it's additional documentation for this. Now, our history in this country is working our way around all these illusions and assuming that certain promises were made to us that were not made to us, taking handouts and crumbs from the table, while other groups at other places fared a little better, but do not assume that slavery was mild any place. Slavery was different, and being different does not mean it is less hard. It means the slave owner was less crude in his administration of the system, but he still administered the system. He still killed. He still sold families from families. All right, now come the American Revolution, we hear all this talk about liberty and justice for all. We believe some of it. Now, again, we have to go over a neglected but well-documented part of our history. The presence of a large number of Caribbean activists in our movement before the American Revolution and after the American Revolution. Why Prince Hall of Barbados, founder of the Masons? Why Peter Ogden, Antigua, founder of the Odd Fellows? Why Russ Wam, one of the first to graduate from a college, one of the editors of Freedom's Journal? Why Robert Campbell, another Jamaican, who would go out with Delaney and search for a place for settlement why this harmony between two African people who don't seem to have much harmony now? Why did they display so much good sense in the 1880s, in the 1800s, and in the 1900s? And we're talking so much nonsense to each other in the 1900s, going to the 21st century. What has happened to us? What made these visiting Caribbeans have a certain kind of nerve and inject a certain kind of sparkle in our movement that wasn't there? They came from a system that gave them the illusion that a free man was free. These were free blacks as against slaves. But a free black in the United States was free in quotes and limited in what he could do. The free black from the Caribbeans was no freer, but he had the illusion that he was supposed to be freer, and he acted accordingly. And yet they gave something to the whole movement that wasn't there. They would help set in motion the colonization society. Ruswan would go to Liberia, find the Liberian Herald, a newspaper still in existence. In the 1850s, they stopped coming in any appreciable numbers. And the free black in the United States began to visit them, because while there was still slavery in Jamaica, throughout the whole Caribbean island, they were free enough to invite black Americans in the struggle to come down and rest up a while. All right, now let's look at the scene they had and the scene we had. In the mental depression brought on by our scene and the slight relief brought on by their scene. They were on an island. They were the majority. When you are the majority, though you are a slave, you get the feeling that ultimately you're going to be the master of the land. And that's true, because most of the time you are going to be the master of the land. They could go up in the hills of Jamaica, and sometimes for months and almost a year they wouldn't see a white man. There was no place we could go where we didn't see him or reminded of his awesome power. Now look what is happening to that mentality. Willis and Huggins would say years later, we rise each morning and petition for the right to live to the end of the day. And the next morning we have to petition all over again. Because this is where the phrase going to meet the man, literally going to get permission to live one more day. But if you're way up in the hills, most of the time you don't see him. So the psychological impact of his presence on your mind is not there. And you know he owns the land, you know he's the master. But physically, you're not looking him in the face every day. So this relieves the mind of being reminded constantly. While in this country, the idea was to drive us stark, raving mad, and he damn near succeeded. You have to understand what happened to these two different people, all African people now. One living under one set of people more brutal than the other, still white people, but one is more brutal than the other. One has no tact at all. The British understand slavery is a business, and they handled it as a business. The American was a sloppy businessman, and sometimes he would kill his investment unnecessarily. I didn't say the British didn't kill. He killed sometimes to warn others that you better not revolt, or you better not step out of line. But he didn't kill for frivolous reasons. He killed for control reasons. Kill one to control 1,000. That's thinking. Brutal thinking, but thinking. America didn't think that way then, don't think that way now. So we had this to contend with. After the American Revolution, now you can see why in the 1850s we would not only need spokesmen, we would begin to create an intellectual atmosphere in the New England states different. We began to create a church atmosphere that was different. And we had to create it that was different. There were very few independent churches in the Caribbean. They're tied to some European church, Scottish church, British church. There was no need because the missionaries, the Moravians, and other missionaries let you in their churches and administered to you. But this didn't happen to us. So we had no choice but to build the independent institutions because we were working with a different kind of psyche and relationship to the white people we had to deal with. See, more and more we're becoming isolated from the Africans and isolated from the Caribbean people. This is what I mean. The lonely African nation away from home. Still an African people no different from any other African people when we left. The difference is the nature of oppression and the nature of the oppressor and our reaction to it. All right, slavery was hard in the Caribbean islands. Slavery was hard here. Why didn't the blues appear in the Caribbean islands? Why didn't the spirituals appear? It had nothing to do with the lack of culture. But the blues and the spirituals are part of our self-induced psychiatry. We had to have it. We had to have relief. We developed through our church and through our reading and misreading of the Bible a romance for Jewish people that we still have. We wanted to associate with a people who escaped from something. Now you can see why we're singing, go down, Moses, tell old Pharaoh, let my people go. What are you talking about? Let your people go. When they become your people? Tell old Pharaoh, let my people go. Now, who was the Pharaoh? They weren't your people. Now, if you read the real history of the story, it comes out differently. They were collaborators with the invaders of Africa. When the Africans came to power, the Africans said that whosoever obeys African law may stay. And those who don't want to obey African law, now that the Africans are back in power, have to go. Those were the ones who decided they wasn't going to obey African law. How did they get to be your people? Go down, Moses, tell old Pharaoh, let my people go. Now, because we do not dig deep enough into African folklore, we don't even know where the first story is recorded about someone parting the sea. We don't know where the Jews copied the story from. And they copied it and said it really happened. This is allegory. Allegory don't have to be true. Caesar B. DeMille made a fortune out of it. Died with so much money his great-grandchildren won't finish spending. Charleston Heston made a lot of money on it. But if you want to know one of the first African stories about parting the sea, a pharaoh was kind of despondent. And so in order to cheer him up, he wanted to go on rowing on the Nile. So all the rowers, the lady rowing the boat, were beautiful ladies. And so the chief lady rowing the boat up ahead was rowing. Then she leaned over and dropped her bracelet in the Nile. She stopped rowing. She got despondent. I ain't gonna row no more. Lost my bracelet. A necklace or something. So the magician, remember, magic had a lot to do with the creation of religions. There's a 2-volume work, Religion and Magic. All right. And so the magician was wrong. She told him. She dropped her necklace or bracelet. He said, all right. So he stepped out, parted the Nile. Then it got dry, reached down, picked up a bracelet, gave it to her. Water came down, and then she rowed the boat on, and everybody was happy. That's the first story. That story was 3,000 years before the Hebrew entry. But if you look at African literature, you can find a duplication of all these stories. And I think some of our spirituals will be changed around. Marian Anderson was singing the story in Egypt, and the Egyptians asked her to stop. I mean, the Arabs, there's no such thing as Egyptians. Egyptians don't rule Egypt. Arabs rule Egypt right now. The Arabs weren't even a people when all this was happening. So they had nothing to do with, none of the greatness of Egypt. The Arabs didn't have nothing to do with it. He was the one that came in and robbed all those graves and stole all that gold. And took some of the stone and built mosques. Some of the mosques are still there. So you call the Arab an Egyptian, you're wrong. But we got a whole lot of misconception. Another one is in the song, Deep River, My Home is Over Jordan. How did your home get to be over Jordan? It's a beautiful song. You should have heard Marian Anderson in her great days. God, she could put you there. That was a singer. Pity she didn't record more. Pity Roland Hayes didn't record more either. What I'm saying is that a circumstance of history shaped each one of us a separate way. And today, sometimes when we are boasting among ourselves, all we're saying is my slave master was better than your slave master, which is the most stupid argument that any two people could ever have. If you're against slavery, then no slave master is good. You get a Bajan would say that his slavery was mild in Barbados in comparison to in Jamaica. So who in the hell cares? What difference did it make? It was still slavery. Slavery wasn't mild any place. Slavery was hard every place. All right. There was a time in Barbados when the rich planters took up all the good land, and the poor planters, slaves and all, picked up and settled along the sea island of Georgia and the cheap land along the American coast of the South. And the people that they brought with them spoke a combination of English and African. This is the origin of the Geechee. The Geechee is nothing but a Bajan. And I've had a Bajan language check it out and prove it positively to be true. But it wasn't a mild situation there either. But I'm saying that that first half of the 19th century, the newspaper building period, the magazine building period, the slave narrative building period, none of this happened in the Caribbean. And if none of this happened in the Caribbean, it had nothing to do with one person's mentality being different from the other. One's illusions and one's condition dictated one thing, and another condition dictated another. Because we were living under the most brutal of all oppressors, we would get an outlet in the spirituals and in the blues. We would sing our way out of it or try to pray our way out of it. Or we would adopt other people's folklore and fasten ourselves to it, any place, to soothe ourselves or to even pretend that ultimately we would be free. Now, on the eve of the Civil War, it was the black abolitionists, too often neglected, Douglas and others, that solidified the cause and made the issue of slavery an emotional issue on the eve of that war. Then you look at the Caribbean islands on the eve of emancipation and look at the United States on the eve of the Civil War and emancipation. You're looking at two different stories. You're looking at two different stories because two different people, both Africans, are reacting to oppression in a different way because they've got different oppressors and must act in a different way and have no choice but to do so. African Americans would go into that war and in one battle alone win 16 Congressional Medals of Honor. It had never been done before. Why did they fight so bravely for a nation that had betrayed them and that still betrayed them? They had the illusion that if they show their manhood, maybe someone will reward them with the concept of citizenship. It was a gamble. But the gamble didn't totally pay off, didn't totally lose either. Because after the Civil War, there was 11 years of pseudo-democracy. Blacks came to power briefly in the South, congressmen, 2 senators, mayors, more mayors in the South than they've got right now. Mayors in cities in the South that have no black mayors now. Galveston, Texas, and a whole lot of places. The position of mayor is one thing, but blacks had certain key state positions in the South during this period that they don't have now, like state position, state director of the state treasury, head of the state parties, solicitor generals on a state level. Now, immediately after emancipation, you want to know, where did all these educated blacks come from? Some of these blacks were mulattoes, in fact, most of them were, whose white father had staked them to an education. Even sent some of them to medical schools in Edinburgh, Scotland. They were the leaders mainly because they could read and write, and this explained why most of the leadership that appeared in black America immediately after the Civil War were light complected. This was not a thing like design. Now, if you look at Jamaica, it was a thing of design. In the United States, it was a thing of convenience. I'm not passing judgment on either one. I'm merely stating a fact. Mavis Campbell, who I talked to today, a brilliant Jamaican journalist and researcher, in her book, The Jamaican Colors, a socio-political history, done the best job on color manifestations in early 19th century Jamaica until the beginning of the 20th century. All right, the second half of that century, we faced some problems that we haven't dealt with and finished dealing with to this day. We had been betrayed. There had been an attempt to sell us back into slavery. The promises of the Reconstruction had been betrayed. And the white friends we had in Congress, it was really only 2, one in Congress and one a senator, Thaddeus Stevens and Sumner, had been blocked off. Not much we could do. Liberia had been settled. The colonization movement was underway. A little-known movement we need to study again, the Negro Convention movement, was meeting every year. We are the meetingest and the talkingest people in all the world. We call more meetings, pass more resolutions, and get less done. Any people in the world. We will meet and vote and forget what we voted for. We were meeting then. Our lodges, women branch, men branch. But that last 25 years, we began to face reality and shared illusions as we never done before. Bishop Turner on the scene, the fiery Georgia Presbyterian, the Back to Africa advocate, the whole concept of Back to Africa before Marcus Garvey, the Chief Sam movement, another Back to Africa movement that appeared in Oklahoma. Chief Sam was a Ghanaian who was going to get some ships and take all of us back. The ships never appeared. A lot of people sold that material, gathered at Galveston, Texas, waiting for the ships to come to take them away. Ships never appeared. They had to go on back home, shame their face, and buy some more furniture and try to live in America. When I say that we are the loneliest nation, that we are the lonely African away from home, we are the ones who were invited to the United States. And when we finished laboring, the job became obsolete. To this day, no African nation has invited us to come home. Officially. The same as Israel has a law that any Jew who wants to return can return. Africa has no such law. Not one nation in all Africa. And yet Africa has more space than Israel. 1,000 times more. In fact, all black Americans fit into one corner of the Sudan and they wouldn't miss the space. Under proper cultivation, we could feed ourselves there too. But the African has been brainwashed into not inviting us home. So we came into the 20th century with illusions. We came into the 20th century with hope. We came into the 20th century changing leadership and arguing about old leadership. It was the Booker T. Washington period. It's the beginning of the Du Bois period. It was the period of the radical black journalists, especially T. Thomas Fortune and Monroe Trotter. It was an outspoken period. It was also a period of riots until we entered the period of the First World War. Marcus Garvey would arrive soon after. He would challenge Du Bois as the center of leadership. And he would succeed where Du Bois had failed, principally because Marcus Garvey could reach an audience that Du Bois could not reach. Du Bois, with his Oxford accent, his Harvard accent, he was always correct, but he did not reach out in such a way to entice the masses of people. What Garvey brought was some illusions taken from his growth in Jamaica. The dream of ships, the dream of nation, the dream of wholeness, and a concept that came out of his maroon background, the idea of redemption and the idea of avenging old wrongs. He was listened to by millions of people, principally because he spoke a language and had a spirit that instantaneously communicated while many of the other intellects did not. We're not dealing with right or wrong. We're dealing with appeal. There had been great men of appeal in this country, but none the equal of Agave. Bishop Turner's preaching was mostly in Georgia, in the southern area. Du Bois was mostly among the intellect and the people he called the talented 10. A lot of blacks did not read Monroe Trotter's The Boston Guardian, nor did they read The Age under another great journalist, T. Thomas Fortune, who many times wrote speeches for Booker T. Washington. Blacks entered the war and came out with more illusions. In the 20s, Marcus Garvey is getting a massive organization underway. Now there's several political strings running side by side. As a literary organization, a movement called the Harlem Renaissance. Marcus Garvey is the political stimulants for that Renaissance. He's given the lonely nation away from home a reason for being. So they invest in his ships, in his schemes. And while they regret having lost a lot, they did not cry, because he gives them a meaning, a stimulus for living different from anything they ever had in their life. It is a lie to say that Marcus Garvey found black America with a wishbone and gave them a backbone. They had a backbone before. They fought before, and they fought hard. But he had a way of communicating, a charismatic way of communicating, that made them think of things that they had never previously considered. And that was one of his great gifts. After his difficulty going to jail and being deported back to his native Jamaica, America would soon go into the Depression. He would be forgotten until the Italian-Ethiopian War. During the Italian-Ethiopian War, he would remind us, and we would remind ourselves, we need to reconsider what he had been said about nation. Because no people can be whole without a concept of nation and nation formation. And he understood something, and this is why he was successful in building the largest mass organization ever right here in the United States. He could never have built it in Jamaica. Couldn't build it in Jamaica of that day, couldn't build it in Jamaica of this day. Because the Jamaicans had the illusion that they have a nation. We had no illusion. We had no illusion about being wanted in this country. Because the Americans have let us know we were not wanted. So a drowning man, when you throw him a rope, he have no time to analyze who threw the rope. He pulls on the rope. You don't try to grab both ends of it either. All we knew that we needed some form of rescue, and we were desperate people. Now as we moved into the period of the Depression literally solidified our ranks. But it was the Italian-Ethiopian War that made us think of nation again. Made us think of wholeness, the protection of nation, made us relive some of Marcus Garvey's teachings about nation and nation structure. And it was with this and all the misgivings that we entered another war with doubts and wondering what we would get out of it. But we had no enthusiasm for the Second World War and didn't suspect that we would get anything out of it. This is why after the war, when the Supreme Court decision about segregation, 1954, we were rather cynical. We didn't believe it because we thought that some hidden thing behind the whole thing, it really wasn't going to work. We were right, it didn't. They haven't integrated the school and not going to. And all places are not completely integrated and not going to be. And we were so happy we let so many of our institutions go. But as the freedom rides got underway, the civil rights movement got underway, the African independence explosion got underway. This was about nation. And here is what we needed to make a reassessment. March the 7th, 1957, when Nkrumah announcing the independence of Ghana said, "At last the long night is over. Ghana, our beloved country, is free forever." We needed, all of us needed to sit down and reassess our approach. We need to reassess Pan-Africanism. Pan-Africanism, a motherless child wandering away from home, had found a mother, had found a geography. Pan-Africanism now could be tied to geography. It became now a meaningful ideology for the survival of African people everywhere. We did not make the reassessment. We did not see the connection. And yet a brilliant Trinidadian saw the connection. George Padmore. And he couldn't get this connection, couldn't get his idea across. He became advisor to Kwame Nkrumah. Really, he was advisor to him from about 45 on. 59, he was dead. When we look at the ideals that went into the African freedom movement and the ideals that mashed with the civil rights movement, the ideals that went into the Caribbean Federation, part of the same ideas came from the fertile mind of George Padmore, the Trinidadian aristocrat, really. Even changed his name so his other family, the rest of the family wouldn't get confused and get put upon because of his radical activity. Came from the nurse family in Trinidad. My main point here is that we have to think now where all of us will go. But principally, we have to think of what's going to happen to the loneliest African nation away from home. Numbering about 40 million people with the best technical training of any African people living outside of Africa. The target for dope, all kind of crack, all kind of crack and wisecrack and everything. Jimmy Carter wanted to reduce their population. AIDS is another way of reducing their population. I'm saying that of all the African people in the world, the ones in the United States is the greatest and most tragic target. The ones in the United States presents the greatest problem to those who wish to control the mineral wealth of Africa, wish to control African people everywhere. You ain't going to have no problem with any African people who announce in the headlines that they're giving medals to those who invade Grenada and not one word of protest about it. You ain't going to have no problem with that. You ain't got no problem there. You got no problem with people who would boast that England is no longer part of our protection, but America's here with our flat tops and our aeroplanes, so you mess with us, America will do you in. All it's done is change slave masters. You ain't got no problem with people like that. But in the United States, you have a group of people with enough technical knowledge to change a continent around. But their mind is so full of misconceptions, and sometimes their body is so full of dope, they can't do what they need to do. And this is all on a purpose to set them up so that they cannot make that connection with Africa. Once that people straighten themselves out, develop an internal force to police the action in their own communities, clear up for themselves, because nobody else is going to do it for them, even if we have to have an internal police force, whether we admit it or not. Charge the church with the role of getting across a new message to the people other than just praying. There's some spirituality in the revitalization of a community and opening up boarded up houses and fixing them and taking welfare people out of hotels and giving their children a healthy environment. Once we discover what we can do ourselves, study Booker T. Washington, W.E.B. Du Bois, and Marcus Garvey, and the concept of nation. The one thing that they do not want to catch on among us is the concept of nation. They have trained us into dependency. We keep worrying about what other people will do for us. We need to stop thinking, and once we begin to do things for ourselves, we can force these other things. We have to have everything that goes into the making of a nation. We should have the equivalent of it. There's enough of us. 40 million people. We should have at least 3 symphony orchestras, 7 theater groups, national, 30 clothing factories, all kind of farms. If you're going to wear wool, then you should have some sheep. When you wear cotton, you should have a cotton field. A lot of them. Own it. I don't mean work on it. Own it. And we will have all of these things once we begin to see ourselves as an African people who must protect ourselves as an African people. I call this the essential selfishness of survival. All people on the face of this earth practice this. And we are late in learning it. That's tomorrow's work and today's work too. If we are tomorrow's people, then we must prepare ourselves to sustain ourselves. And we cannot go into another century asking other people to do for us. In one of her last speeches before she died, Mary Clyde Bethune said, we must change from a people begging and pleading to a people insisting and demanding. If our peoplehood is to emerge and to be part of the humanity of the world, if we are to build nations again and to project ourselves again on the world, there's no one to do it but ourselves for ourselves. We are not only capable of building a new humanity for ourselves, we are capable of building a new humanity for the world. But let's start with ourselves. You can change the world if at first you change yourself. Thank you very much.